Okay, good morning again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the release of Giving Away the Future, How Louisiana's Industrial Tax Incentive Program, or ITEP, has failed to produce prosperity. My name is Ben Hunkler, and I'm the Communications Manager for the Ohio River Valley Institute, or ORVI, an independent nonprofit research and communication center founded in 2020. Our work charts a course for shared prosperity, clean energy, and more equitable civic structures in Central Appalachia and beyond. Our research finds that generations of resource extraction have hollowed out local economies and fossil fuel communities across the nation, hemorrhaging jobs and accelerating population decline. Our team of experts have demonstrated how transitioning to clean energy, prioritizing efficiency upgrades, and deploying large-scale initiatives to clean up fossil fuel damage can uplift holistic, place-based economic development models that improve quality of life, revitalize economic and job growth, and build community-wide shared prosperity. Today's report takes a critical look at Louisiana's controversial industrial tax incentive program, a cornerstone of the state's business-first economic development strategy that aims to lure projects from large corporations with generous tax breaks. Since 1998, ITEP has disbursed more than $20 billion in taxpayer-funded incentives. Yet, as we'll see during today's program, these handouts have produced few returns for Louisiana residents and for the state's struggling economy, which has seen no new net job growth and continues to rank near last in key metrics of equity and prosperity. Yet, just last Wednesday, Governor Jeff Landry signed an executive order killing ITEP's job creation and retention requirements and removing meaningful opportunities for local input, moves that cast even greater doubt on ITEP's ability to generate economic growth and prosperity in the future. Our research analyzes the overall effectiveness of ITEP with the most rigorous economic and statistical analysis of the program to date, using actual jobs and income data. We assess whether ITEP has been at all correlated with net job and income increases in the state, or whether the program simply represents a subsidy that shuffles money around the state and provides a windfall for multinational corporations who export most of their production value outside of Louisiana's borders. It's my pleasure to introduce economist and ORVI senior researcher Nick Messenger, the author of today's report. Nick holds a master's degree in agricultural, environmental, and development economics from The Ohio State University and is a doctoral candidate in the same field. Nick has previously served as a senior research assistant with the SWANK program in rural urban policy at The Ohio State University, and his research focuses on regional economic development policy, energy economics, and industrial tax policy. And his work has been nominated for the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association Quality of Communication Award. Nick's research on revitalizing former energy communities with alternative quality of life investments and small businesses has been presented on behalf of the federal governments of the United States and Chile at last year's COP28 Global Climate Summit in Dubai, as well as various economic and industry conferences, including the North American Regional Science Council, the Southern Regional Science Association, and the Edison Electric Institute. In just a moment, Nick will present key findings and implications from his report, and we'll have time for questions and comments at the end. But please feel free to add those questions or comments to the chat or Q&A during the presentation, and we will address them later in the order that they're received. Lastly, I'd just like to mention that today's program is being recorded and that we provide closed captions at the bottom of your screen. So thanks again for joining us today, and without further ado, I will pass it over to Nick for today's presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. And thank you all for taking time out of your day to join. I know it's not always the most attractive topic to come talk about tax incentives, especially close to lunchtime. But this is an important report. And I think that a lot of you actually probably are folks that I have read your work on this. So I'm going to try to dive more into how the research that we've done and the analysis we've done maybe contributes to some of the story that you all have been covering for a while. I'm not reinventing the wheel here. So first, thanks for your coverage of ITEP over the years and the various kind of political battles and economic strategies that have been released and have used ITEP across various projects. So Ben kind of read my resume through, and you might be wondering what the heck is a group called, something with Ohio in their name presenting this report. And my background and a lot of our background in the research we do is focused on economic development and not just economic development, but sustainable economic development. And I don't necessarily mean just green, climate friendly economic development, but actual development that produces results, right? It takes communities that have traditionally been downtrodden. Our region of the country that we most often operate in is Appalachia, but there's definitely a ton of linkages between Appalachia, especially in the shale gas boom, and the attempts to bring kind of petrochemical plastics industries to Appalachia and the Gulf Coast. And so where this report comes in is thinking about how tax incentives, whether it's in Louisiana or in places in our part of the country or any state really, play a role in kind of this big momentum that industry has. And really, we wanted to ask the question, does this work? Is this an effective strategy? We haven't seen it work very well in our parts of the country. And so that's what brought me down to explore what is perhaps the largest tax exemption program in the country in Louisiana in ITEP. And so this report I want to frame from the beginning is an empirical study. We are not forecasting. We are not cherry picking a single project and saying, oh, this one factory didn't work out. What we really do is we collect out the data between the state's ITEP data from the Louisiana Economic Development dated FastLane database. We pair that and connect it to federal government data from the quarterly census of employment and wages, from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, from the census Bureau, and we actually build out a model that uses real data from the past and says, okay, based on how much each parish in the state exempted out of ITEP, did they get any kind of correlation after the fact for their job growth or income growth? And I'm not going to bury the lead. The answer is no. The answer is that outside of our confidence intervals, and typically econometric models, we're talking 90% confidence, right? That we want to be more than 90% sure that the results just aren't some random correlation. And there's no correlation. The slope of the line is flat. So essentially what we do is we test this against job growth, total job growth. A lot of the thinking around ITEP that I'll talk and touch briefly on at the back half of why this program is conceived the way it is centers around, oh, well, if we give a bunch of money and tax incentives to one company, they'll come, the construction workers will come, the employees will come, those folks will live here and spend their money, and it will have this multiplicative effect, right? Multiplier effect, where the folks who get paid by the company will spend their money on groceries and houses and, cars and retail outlets and restaurants, and everybody else will prosper too. And what we see is that total job growth is pretty flat once you control for demographic, geographic, and economic baseline characteristics, right? So we actually go get industry composition data. We get age demographics, racial demographics, education demographics. We put in control variables for the geographic locations. So we try to insert a variable into the model that would account for as much explanation of different economic factors as we can and demographic factors. And what that leaves us with is a variable for the amount of tax dollars that the parish exempts to ITEP. So all of this is at the parish level. So not to get too technical, but what we try to do in building a good model is you try to basically see, does this ITEP variable, once you control for everything else that could impact, jobs and income growth that you can get data for, does this ITEP variable have a positive association with jobs or with income? And the answer is no in both cases in our study. So if we go to the next slide, this is the visual representation of that. So this is output from our econometric regression model with fixed effects, if anybody has covered this type of economic work before. And what you see is each blue dot is essentially a parish in a year. The study looks at post-reform years. ITEP was reformed in 2016. And so we look until the beginning of 22. And so what you see on the x-axis, the horizontal line is ITEP exemptions as a percent of each parish's levied taxes. And what you see on the vertical axis is the change in total jobs and the change in personal income. And what you see is that there's really no clear-cut relationship. The red line, which is our fitted trend line, is relatively flat. Often the parishes that saw the most change, the most job growth, the most positive income growth, were parishes that exempted, less than 10% of their levied taxes as a percentage of taxes to ITEP. And so what you see is that maybe ITEP isn't the big kind of harbinger of job growth and income growth that the state has projected it to be in the past. So if we go to the next slide, I do think that I might recap kind of the theory here, which is one, taxpayers, if they're exempting dollars, right, there should be some sort of positive return on that investment, ROI. If you're giving up funds that you could use for other stuff, infrastructure, school, healthcare, sheriff's offices, you name it, we should be getting something back for that, right? And that's true anywhere across the country that you do tax incentive programs. And so ITEP was really created back in 36, right? As almost as a response to Mississippi, which launches one of the first industrial tax incentive programs in the country. It's in the region. It's kind of easy to connect the dots on politics in the 1930s to maybe see why the state was interested in recruiting manufacturers against competitors in the region. And so it's really been 80 plus years that this program has existed, virtually unchanged until 2016. And the bottom line of our study is really, if you build it, they don't always come. And even in the cases where they do come, they don't necessarily benefit Louisiana residents. The state has dropped 5 spots since 1930, which would have been before ITEP was implemented. So you've got 80 years of this massive tax incentive program to decline 5 spots relative to the other 50 states, the other 49 states. Personal income in the state, if you just look at the region, in the southeast region of the country from the BEA data. Personal income per capita, which is a pretty good measure of quality of life or living standard, was 14% higher than the average of the southeast region in 1930. In 2022, which is the most recent data year, Louisiana's personal income per capita was 7.3% lower than the same southeast average, despite the state having slower population growth relative to other states in the Southeast. So when you have income per capita, you could change income or you can change population. So if the population boomed, maybe you could see that decline, but the raw population numbers suggest that the reason that the Louisiana lost ground was not because it grew people-wise, but because it did not grow as fast income-wise. And so that kind of toggles back to our first point in blue, which is what is the positive ROI on ITEP? And then you add in many of the stories that a lot of you have covered over the years about how, despite being kind of conceived as a manufacturer tax incentive, the manufacturing has really become petrochemical, petroleum-based, which can have kind of devastating economic and environmental impacts when you consider their whole cost at the end. So if we go to the next slide, this is just another, I don't want to harp on Louisiana's poor performance, but I think, and everyone's probably keenly aware, if you've abated $20 billion in the last 25 years and more, if you go all the way back to 1936, you would hope if you were a stockholder in the state and you thought of the exempted tax dollars as your investment, you would hope for a better return than being dead last or close to it across the board. This is from US News and World Report's rankings for last year. I do want to specifically point out that 44th in business environment, even if we wanted to concede or say, well, ITEP is good for business, businesses who US News and World Report solicit this feedback from seem to disagree, that despite the massive tax incentive program that's larger than what pretty much any other state awards, with a little bit easier way to get it, the state has not done that well, even in its business environment. So we'll go to the next slide. You can see that the cancer incidence rates, right? This report's not directly about health, but I'll talk about how healthcare and environmental costs factor into how we have to think about economic development. A lot of the parishes that receive the largest ITEP exemptions are far above the US national average from the National Cancer Institute data. This is not news, I know, to anybody on the call, with the place in the state, that's nicknamed Cancer Alley, but it's still pretty stark to see and to start to think about how all of this is really connected in some way to economic development policy and ITEP. So if we go to the next slide, my last kind of, things aren't going so hot in the state. This is the raw data compared to some other key oil producing petroleum-based economies around the country. And you can see population loss in Louisiana since 2016, since after 2016. And even when the state has grown prior to 2016, it has actually grown much slower than places like North Dakota, New Mexico, Alaska, or Colorado. And certainly Texas. And so you start to wonder, okay, well, we're one of the only states losing people. despite the billions and billions of dollars of this that we've exempted in this tax exemption program. And even when we weren't losing people, we weren't gaining people as fast as other states that don't have this big program. So what has really benefited? What has come of this? So we'll go to the next slide. I won't dwell on this one, but this is a chart from the report for folks who might not be familiar with ITEP that really breaks down the kind of three key phases. And when I started this 8 months ago, I had no way of knowing that we would release the report less than a week after the new governor had changed it again. So there, I had to add a whole column to this chart at the last minute. But you can see for most of the program's history, it was 100% exemption. Folks who have a manufacturer's NAICS code 31, 32, 33, although certainly you could have a subsidiary company that qualifies as a manufacturer too. You could, until the 2016 reform, you could get maintenance and replacement of equipment for 10 years, 2 terms, you had to renew it. There were no real job requirements and no mechanism for local control or local input. So you had sheriffs who didn't have input, school boards, parish councils. And the 2016 reform really changed that. It lowered to 80, which is a step in the right direction. The governor didn't approve maintenance and replacement requests, and most importantly, implemented a local step whereby local municipal government entities had to approve the ITEP application, which local folks tend to know what their communities need and don't need under most cases. But last week's repeal or executive order that changed, I guess, ITEP again. We're still not quite sure on qualifying investments on maintenance and capital, but there really are no job requirements any longer with the executive order. And the local approval process still exists, but it's been consolidated down to a single board that's made up of representatives from those other governments. But the kind of caveat to that is the state and the governor, the state's Board of Industry and Commerce and Governor Landry still have the ability to override a local control decision. So that's an interesting component that we'll have to see how it develops. So Ben, if we go to the next slide. So basically, why is this the result? Part of what we do as researchers is when you get a stark result, which is, all these years of billions of dollars, job growth and income growth really didn't happen relative to other states. So why not? So we'll walk through the explanation. A lot of times these types of projects that receive ITEP incentives and incentives from other states and communities around the country are justified with these really great job projections. So you come in and you say, businesses create jobs and we're going to bring all these new employees to the region. It's going to be amazing. This is such a good investment. You should give us a tax incentive so that we can build it here, and then it's going to pay for itself in the long run. And a lot of times industry companies use what are called input-output models, which essentially are inflated multipliers. There's commercial software out there. Implan is a very famous one. The model is very good and useful for certain questions, but it's kind of that old adage, if you ask a model a question it's not quite making good enough assumptions to answer, you're going to start getting bad answers. And so that's really what happens here, is that these models are not really capable of being accurate, realistic forecast numbers for jobs, but they are good at visualizing how certain sectors and industries interconnect. So not to get too in the weeds, but essentially we use the wrong model to forecast, not we, but industry. But the theory is, a job creates income, people spend their money in the community, that spending then circulates and creates more jobs and income. We call this a multiplier effect. The input-output models are really popular with industries because they produce really high multipliers. They look really good. So if you go in to ask for taxpayer subsidy from a state or parish or city, you want to have that number look good, right? Oh, it's going to create 400 new jobs when you consider its broader impact on the economy. And there's really no way to verify it, right? I can't go back and hold the weather person accountable if it doesn't rain when they say it's going to. And same theory here. It's a forecast. We don't have a lot of mechanisms to go back and hold a company accountable when they over predicted their jobs. So if we go to the next slide, we'll visualize this a little bit. So this is actually what you probably should think about when you try to forecast jobs. So, okay, I've got this ITEP company that's receiving ITEP. It's going to build a factory in my parish. So there's a big green arrow. Okay, I'm going to get a couple hundred jobs, right? I want to be really clear that we're not saying nobody works for ExxonMobil or nobody works for CF Industries or any of the other ITEP recipients. But when you zoom out to the state as a whole or the parish as a whole, it's not a net gain, because what actually happens in the economy, because we have markets, is when you change one piece, you create a ripple effect that starts changing other pieces in both positive and negative ways. And so you can think about how a new factory might change some of these other pieces. You might increase pollution. You might change healthcare expenses if you do that. You might have a factory that buys up more land because they're subsidized. And so now farmers or other businesses or even homeowners who want, a developer who wants to buy or develop a residential neighborhood, land is now more expensive because we're competing with a subsidized company to get it. And so you've bid up that price. One we hear a lot in the news lately is worker wages, which face value might be good for workers. But if you think about small businesses who are trying to hire, it's difficult to compete to hire if you're hiring from the same pool of workers that a large multi-billion-dollar subsidized factory facility is hiring. And so even though the factory may be a positive jobs in the column, you're actually subtracting because the business that was going to hire some of those workers is no longer going to hire them at a higher dollar per hour value, right? Or there just simply aren't enough workers. So the factory gets the workers and the local business doesn't. And so it cuts back its hours or it scales back its, operations in other ways. And so there's actually some offsetting economic activity that doesn't happen when you have these things come in, right? Because they're competing with the subsidized company. You might see a decline in home values and property taxes for schools or services. When you plop a big factory down, you probably make land near it less valuable to folks who have families or young children who want to move to the community. They're not going to buy a house right next door to a factory if they can help it. And then the last one's really important, which is, are you creating high-paying jobs in state? When you subsidize or support local business, you know that the business owner lives in your community or lives in your state, but that's not the same as when you do it to a multinational company who might be headquartered in Houston or overseas. And so where does the company you're giving ITEP exemptions to actually have their CEO, their financial office, their marketing department? Some of these kind of college degree requirement jobs that are typically higher salaried might not even be in the state. And so what type of job are you creating is a big question that most of the models don't really consider. And so if we go to the next slide, the traditional forecasting models really only look at this. And they say, oh, we're going to create 500 new jobs, or oh, this new export terminal is going to bring 1,000 new jobs. And it's really an all gravy forecast, right? It's like, oh, well, of course, we're just going to add a net new. It's going to be awesome, right? If you build it, they'll come and it's going to be magical. And unfortunately, I wish it worked like that. I really do. But unfortunately, if you don't consider any of the possible negatives, you can't get a negative answer, right? And that is the case, not just in analyzing ITEP traditionally and forecasting jobs, but that's the case across the country as well. And a big piece of our research is focused on kind of sharing a more accurate, better way we should consider thinking about these job estimates. So we'll go to the next slide. A couple kind of tack-on points before I'll answer questions. Many ITEP recipients are industries that are shrinking nationally or are mismatches for the state's residents and skills. So one of the kind of catch-22 issues, right, is if you are abating public dollars that might otherwise go, or a fraction of them might otherwise go to schools and education or the state's university system, then the property tax dollars don't. But overall, if we think about what the state is investing in, the state may not be investing in the things that produce the skilled workers who actually are needed by companies that are coming as they automate more. We typically think of automation as I don't need workers because I've got robots. But I think it's a little more complicated in that when you have so much high-tech manufacturing, the skill set of workers you need to actually manage all of the technology is quite high and quite technical. It doesn't necessarily mean college degree. It could mean trade school. It could mean just a ton of experience. But it's hard to get that experience or give that experience to residents and training to residents if you're simultaneously reducing service funding to get the company in the first place. And so you kind of end up in this vicious cycle. And that's where you say, when you talk to folks, you hear this is true in Louisiana, but it's true up here in Ohio and Pennsylvania too. You get a lot of out-of-state workers. You get a lot of folks who move to the region who get reassigned or relocated. They have to get moved from Houston to Baton Rouge, or they have to move, somewhere else that they maybe don't want to live. And the reality is, when people don't want to live somewhere, they don't invest there the same way that they do if they are a resident who's already committed and has a history and their family's there, and it's a place they want to be. So I think it's fair to ask, in part, does ITEP really pay taxpayer dollars for the state to chase a bigger piece of a shrinking pie? And if so, is that the right strategy to try to just keep competing with other states for more and more of something that there's inherently less and less of? So we'll go to the next slide. I think one thing you have to really consider, Milton Friedman said there's no such thing as a free lunch. And I always kind of, whatever you think about Milton Friedman, I always kind of come back to that quote when I talk about tax incentives, because when you model it that way and you just look at the big green arrow going up and say, this is all great, this is all business, we're going to make all these jobs, you're actually kind of being disingenuous about the actual cost of the program. And it's not just dollars, right? It's opportunity cost. What could you do with those dollars instead? And if you did something else with them, would that have a bigger multiplier effect on local communities and people who live in the state and in the parishes? So the report just includes, it's more to make an example of, if you took the sum of all the ITEP dollars and you poured it into any of these jobs, you could actually hire, thousands more preschool kindergarten teachers, childcare workers, firefighters, sheriff's deputies, park rangers, librarians. You could maintain more miles of road across the state. These aren't necessarily suggestions, right? We should study and think about, are there examples where paying these folks more, hiring more of them, has actually generated a better economic impact than paying a couple hundred people to work at a chemical factory? I think that's a fair question after 88 years of this tax program and the state still ranking where it does economically. Another example we highlight in the report is that every teacher in the state's about $12,000 lower than the national average teacher salary for Louisiana teachers. You could spend less than the annual ITEP allotment. I think it's actually less than half of the annual ITEP foregone taxes. And you could give every single teacher in the state a raise equal to that gap. So essentially, you could raise the state's average to the national average teacher salary with the ITEP money, right? Again, not necessarily a blanket policy suggestion, but these are the true costs, right? When you're choosing to give the exemption to a company for a project, you're inherently not choosing to do these other things with it. And maybe some of those other options are better strategy or better investments in the long run. So if we go to the next slide, another key thing we point out in the study is that large companies, believe it or not, across the country are actually net job destroyers. And every time I say that, people kind of gawk for a second and think, well, wait a minute, Amazon, these big, huge companies employ hundreds of thousands of people between their direct employees and their supply chains around the world and country. And individual companies in individual years might add jobs, but then they might lay those folks off again when the market changes 4 or 5 years later, right? They might hire new people. We see it right now with a lot of the tech industry. They hired a bunch of people during the pandemic, and now that the pandemic and technology needs and work from home are kind of decreasing a bit, a lot of tech companies are doing layoffs, right, to try to bring the share price, affect the share price or their competitiveness financially. So what does that really mean? Well, the US government tracks it, the business dynamic statistics, and essentially year zero businesses, kind of common sense, are job creators, people who are startups right now, who are entrepreneurs. And everybody else, a business that has existed for 1 year to over 200 years, when you add them together across the country, you lose jobs year after year after year between layoffs. And so that's not to say large companies don't have economic impact, but they don't quite have the same short-term economic impact that startups, entrepreneurs, small businesses, local businesses do. And so that's just something to consider, is that ITEP very rarely, it's not subsidizing. It's very hard to be a startup nitrogen fertilizer producer, or very hard to be a startup steel mill. So you don't necessarily support these types of endeavors with the ITEP program, right? You're not supporting some of the folks on the small business side or startup side who might actually kind of have a punch above their weight, so to speak, economically in terms of impact. So if we go to the next slide, An interesting finding is that this kind of came out of the report, and this is something I would like to study more in the future. But in talking with folks in putting this together, ITEP probably plays a pretty significant role in actually redistributing resources around the state. This is probably not news to any of you who live in the state and work there and cover this, but this map is kind of instructive, I think, because essentially parishes exempt money with ITEP, and traditionally that's been something that they've been forced to do by the state board that approves the ITEP. They don't necessarily get a say. And so if you build a factory in a parish, that parish gives up tax revenue to do it. But that doesn't mean the workers live in the parish that gives up the money. And so if you give up the money and you get the factory, you get the pollution in some cases that goes with the factory, but the folks who get the income commute. They might drive up to the parish just north of you or just east of you. And so what this map shows is the percentage of GDP production, the actual value of all the stuff that we make and produce, that is retained as worker earnings from the BEA. And so the author calculations part is I essentially just divide, right, to make a fraction, earnings divided by GDP to get a percentage. And so you can see the red parishes retain typically less than 20% of their GDP. 80% of the value produced in those parishes, economic value, does not go to workers in those parishes. Versus in the green parishes, you're up over 100%, right? And how do you get 100%, more than 100% of GDP? You have GDP flow into your parish from somewhere else. You have people who use their mailing address in your parish as their tax address to file their taxes, but they actually are working at a site or earning income that's coming from out of state or another parish. And so I'm not saying that the entire gap is all ITEP and all these factories, right? It's not the gap between 20 and 170%, but certainly this is worth something, worth exploring and something we want to think about more, which is, how many dollars are flowing out of the red into the green? And is ITEP playing a role in that, where the red is actually getting kind of a double whammy, where they're getting workers who don't live there, who aren't paying taxes there, aren't buying stuff there, aren't shopping there, but they're also giving up their already existing tax dollars to get the company to come build a plant in the first place, right? So they're losing their public service revenue, and they're not even getting the folks who are coming to trigger those multiplier effects and respend their money locally. They're spending it up in the kind of commuter neighborhoods somewhere else. So again, this is something that in the future, I think we'd like to zoom in and think about harder and kind of see if there's a way to kind of track some of those flows and continue to tell that story. So we'll click one more. But the real headline here, right, is that states compete for these projects. Louisiana uses ITEP to try to compete with other states, and that's not a real justification. It's a race to the bottom. People vote with their feet. They move to places they want to live. And investing in quality of life, in services, in skill sets for residents and entrepreneurs who already are in Louisiana, who are rooted there, who want to grow and want the state and their community to grow, is a higher bang for buck and typically a cleaner economic development strategy to begin to reverse that kind of 88-year slog of losing ground with ITEP. Many of the big businesses will still come anyway, as I think we saw with the ExxonMobil facility in East Baton Rouge, that actually the school board did not grant the ITEP under the reform. Sometimes some of these companies are still going to come for other reasons. It's a great place to ship things from. There's other assets in the region that will attract them without having to sweeten the pot with more subsidy. And so I'll close out with this quote that I think really, really captures how tax incentives can go awry, which is, whenever the government approves a company to get a tax incentive, they're picking a winner, right? They're thinking that an investment in that company is smart. And it's pretty clear across the country over the last few decades that governments don't know how to pick winners very well. They're not good at reading markets and giving out money to folks who end up doing well. But losers always know how to pick their governments. And that is almost universally true, that folks who come and apply for tax subsidies sometimes aren't in the best financial shape. They're not the most resilient companies. They're not the companies that are going to always succeed. So I always include that quote because I think it's pretty apt. Governments don't know how to pick winners, but losers always know how to pick their governments. And so hopefully this report will continue to shed some light and advance the conversation around ITEP. And I'd be happy to take comments or questions And again, I just want to stress, I've read so many articles in the course of the last, almost a year now studying this. And so I'm almost positive I've probably read things that you all, if you're in the media, if you're a journalist, have written. And so thanks for covering this story and working on this. And I also want to make sure that I give a shout out to Together Louisiana and some of the groups down there that have done a lot of this data collection and have talked about this, have advanced this discussion, because a lot of the data that they've worked to kind of comb through and consolidate into one place is extremely helpful to other researchers and other folks who want to talk about this issue. So that's what I've got to share, and happy to take questions or comments. And thank you all for joining for part of your day.
Thank you so much, Nick. Yeah, so please feel free to add questions to the chat or to the Q&A. In the meantime, I've posted a link to view and download the full report, as well as our summary and digital toolkit in the chat here. So we invite you to check that out at your leisure. Nick, to start us off, could you talk a little bit about the implications of this report, what it means in the context of Landry's executive order and for Louisiana moving forward?
Yeah, I think, one of the ways that I would conceptualize it is, if the state has bet for 88 years that ITEP will be the thing that will just, the next business that gets ITEP will be the thing that really kickstarts an economic turnaround in the state. I don't know that I would go to a casino and bet 88 times in a row and lose 88 times in a row and think that I should go an 89th time, right? That's not something that is probably the best economic development strategy but I understand there's politics and there's a lot of reasons you might want to do it. But the evidence is pretty clear that there's really not a point in the history of the state. The state grew about 35% slower between 1936 and 2023 than the country at large, right? So even if you wanted to point back to the 50s and 60s and 70s and say, well, ITEP worked once upon a time, but now it's not working, so we should just tweak it. There's not really any evidence that ITEP has ever worked. The state has pretty consistently lost ground since the 40s, since after World War II. And so I think there's a real thought that it might be time to rethink the entire strategy, not just tweak the strategy. The 2016 reform I would characterize from an evidence standpoint as a step in the right direction. What is the goal? If the goal is to totally rethink economic development strategy to actually focus on the folks in Louisiana. If the middle step is we reformed it in 2016, I think the most recent executive order goes the completely wrong direction, which is we're going to undo the reforms and we're going to really lean back into ITEP as our main tool in the toolbox. It's like trying to build a house with a like rubber mallet or something. And it's just not effective. It's not getting the job done.
Thank you. Nick, do you have any insight on how representatives will be chosen for the new local boards, and what kind of the stripping of that local control looks like for the effectiveness of ITEP moving forward?
I don't. I've read the text of the executive order that they're going to consolidate the boards. I think by default, and if anybody in the chat has more insight to this, I think by default it's going to be some local officials, but I'm not sure if those local officials, like if the sheriff of a parish is going to serve on the board, or if the sheriff has the ability to appoint someone to serve, kind of as a representative of the sheriff's office on the board, that kind of thing. And so the consolidation of the boards, again, we'll have to see how it plays out. Keeping some element of local approval is appealing. What I think is the important part is the caveat that now the State Board of Commerce and Industry or the governor kind of have the final say. And so I think there's kind of an element of, well, what if this state board or what if this local board denies it? Can the governor just say, well, actually, we're going to do it anyway? And I think that's really kind of the key question of that reform. And I see Jan has a question about local authorities having the right to reject the exemptions. I think one thing I've found that's true across the country, working with local, like parish or in other states, county level, local school boards, is that they are just elected, for the most part, elected local people who want to make their community better. They want jobs. They want to they want to hope that things can improve economically in their community. They don't get a lot of options. They don't get 20 different people coming and making them 20 different sales pitches. So if you're in a community that has traditionally struggled and you're a school board member there and you know the community's struggling and someone comes along and says, I can throw you a lifeline. If you approve this ITEP exemption, we can build a facility. It's going to bring jobs. It's going to bring more revenue. If you kind of get that snake oil pitch and that's all you get, that's the only option you have, right? So then your option is I can decline the one sales pitch I got and do nothing, or I can hope that this is the real deal and the last one we approved that didn't really do very much isn't, it is the outlier. And so I think that's really the focus of a lot of our research is we're not saying across the board everywhere in the country tax incentives are bad, right? But we give an awful lot of tax exemptions for an awful little return, which maybe makes us think that we should be smarter about who we give tax exemptions to, and also makes us think across the country that there might be other ways to do things. So a lot of our research is aimed at exploring those, putting evidence and data out there and saying, could we find a better way that's maybe a more balanced mix where, sure, you're going to do a project with tax incentives and try to get a company that makes sense. They're making the types of jobs that people there have the skills to get hired for and work. But we're also not just doing tax incentives. We want to do other stuff that's going to be investments in small business and entrepreneurs and trades and, that type of thing as well.
Thank you, Nick. While we're on the subject of local input into ITEP, we're joined today by Aaron Hansen of Together Louisiana, who has some additional context about the composition of these parish ITEP committees. So, Aaron, if you'd like to come up mute and quickly introduce yourself and share any insight you have, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Ben, and thank you, Nick, for this incredible work and this presentation. It's really powerful. I did get the executive order that Governor Landry released. Came out on Thursday, I think it was. I think he made the announcement on Wednesday, and the executive order came out on Thursday. The executive order does have to be enacted in rules, so there's still a chance for what's stated in the executive order to change, right? But it does say that the local ITEP, parish ITEP committees will be comprised of the sheriff or a designee of the sheriff, the school board president or the superintendent of the school board, and then the parish president or the police jury president. So a representative from the three major taxing bodies whose revenues are at stake, and that's the sheriff, the school board, and the parish council or the police jury. And then if the project is in a city, the mayor of the city also gets to serve on that committee. And then there are non-voting members, which can be representatives from the Economic Development Council and from, sort of various other folks who might have an interest in the ITEP. We were pleased, just our perspective is like, overall, we think it's a weakening of the local control provision, but it could have just been appointees from those boards. And so the fact that it is actually the elected officials themselves who serve on that committee, we think is a good thing.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. And I think the point you made that a lot of things are in flux. This just came out last week, so nothing like doing an 8-month-long report and then having all of this information flood and come out 6 days before you're ready to publish it. But there's going to be a lot coming out, and I think in discussions and news around this in the coming months. I know we've got about 10 minutes left, 15 minutes left, so I want to just answer some of the questions. There were two in the Q&A that talked about successful exemption programs in other states. And so one piece I really want to highlight is that kind of baseline for a tax exemption program is you should have some sort of clawback mechanism where if the promise doesn't materialize in some capacity, some amount of that money is returned to the community, right? And so kind of a blank check, we don't need the money back, hope it works out approach to tax exemption is just not very good business practice, right? So I think there are states that have this in practice. There are different examples. None at the scale that ITEP is. ITEP is massive. But there are states that engage in kind of these clawback, and cities, city level policy or parish level policy that engage in these types of, well, we'll award you this grant, but if you don't meet X, Y, and Z, benchmarks by certain deadlines, you're, whether that's construction phase or whether you're employing there, or if you leave within X number of years after the thing expires, you owe a portion of the money back. There's a lot of different ways you could think about a clawback. But what you really want to prevent is this, ITEP can go for 10 years. You really want to prevent somebody getting it for 10 years and then going and trying to negotiate a new tax incentive in some other state, right? Okay, thanks, Louisiana, for your 10 years of tax exemptions. We're going to take our business to another state that is going to give us a new package for another 10 years, right? And that's what we mean when we talk about race to the bottom, is if you're just competing and you're just doing this for the sake of, we've got to beat Mississippi, we've got to be more competitive than Georgia or Texas or wherever, then you're kind of starting out for the wrong reasons, right? You're not thinking very clearly about what does this actually mean for the state. So I think the two questions would be other states and cities. The clawback mechanism is really important. And I think that's why the jobs requirement, it could be an important piece. The 16 reform, I don't believe, and Aaron, you can drop in the chat if I'm totally wrong, but did not have a clawback. There was not a mechanism in place to enforce it. And I also want to highlight that this is something we're seeing in our region, where with a lot of the building stuff around the Inflation Reduction Act, there's things called community benefits agreements, which, it's kind of the company comes in and works with the community, and they draft this, thing that says, we're going to make all these promises and be good stewards and neighbors. That's great, but you have to have some sort of enforcement, right? You have to have something that happens if somebody doesn't hold up their end of the bargain. And so tax exemptions and programs that do that are really probably the best way forward for not just Louisiana, but all states. I don't know if you could do that at the scale of ITEP. I don't know if you could realistically get billions of dollars back from some of these companies. So that might be something to think about. The other piece I'll throw out there is, it can sometimes make sense to subsidize or incentivize companies that are aligned with the people who already live in the state, right? There is a reason that Silicon Valley can't be replicated anywhere else. When I talk about this in Ohio, I always show the list of every city in the world that said they want to be Silicon Valley. Silicon, Columbus and New York and Atlanta and Erie, Pennsylvania and London. Nowhere else is Silicon Valley. You can't subsidize your way to being Silicon Valley. Amazon built a second headquarters and everybody lined up to give them a bunch of money to do it. They picked Virginia anyway, which was already an affluent area, and they're already scaling back the plans for their second headquarters, right? You can't recreate some of these booms if your state or your region doesn't have any kind of history. You wouldn't have expected it to work in the 1950s or 60s if Colorado started deciding they wanted to make cars and compete with Michigan, right? Like Detroit. Like, it wasn't going to happen. We could have given billions of dollars away to try to get car manufacturers to move to Colorado and make Fords there. It's hard to do something your state has no history of, right? And that's not a very good investment. And so again, I think if we're talking about what does a good tax incentive program look like, it's a program that thinks about, okay, what does Louisiana already have some sort of comparative advantage in doing? And let's only focus on really being kind of, particular about what we subsidize that grows and fosters and allows us to continue to improve at things that are already successful, instead of trying to we're going to start a brand new Silicon Valley or a brand new thing in the middle of our state that we have no history in, our employees have no workers in. That's a recipe to have companies relocate out of state employees to your state at best. A lot of times those projects don't ever get off the ground, in their state. So it relies heavily on industry, how to overhaul the program while still incentivizing new industry and economic drivers. This goes back to thinking about, people live where they want where they want to be. They don't want to live next to a factory, and a factory doesn't automatically get filled with people just because you build it. I think we see this kind of across the country, that people move to places that have high quality of life. They have natural amenities. Louisiana, I would say, and again, I don't want to stretch too far outside of my lane here, but you've got a lot of coast line. I don't have that in Ohio, right? We don't have the Gulf of Mexico in Ohio, but you see other states capitalize on their coasts in terms of quality of life, clean environment, tourism, maybe more so than Louisiana does, right? And that's something that, if you build a bunch of export terminals along the coast, you might not actually get as much value as if you had thought about using the coast in a different way, right? I'm not saying that that's necessarily true. We should study that. People should study that. We should actually do the analysis and think about it. But I think this idea that if you build it, they will come, building big business things equals jobs. This report really shows that's not true. And there are examples out there. We have a report on Centralia, Washington. There's some Brookings studies by folks focused on quality of life. If you have strong retail outlets, you have restaurants, you have quality homes, you have parks, you have recreation, you have, small business supported environments, you have good community colleges and public schools, that attracts people. I always say when I talk about economic development, the best stat you can show me about economic development is show me school enrollment, because people bring their families and live where there is a high quality of life, and economic opportunity will follow. It does not always follow a factory getting built, but it will follow people who want to come live in the community and invest in the community. And Texas, that gets pretty complicated with the reimbursement. Sorry, I'm just reading through these. So Ben, flag me if I'm missing people's questions. But yes, you could potentially start to think about reimbursement. We have some programs here in Ohio where we tried to do this, where the school board could actually negotiate a side deal with the company. So the company would say, oh, well, we'll write you a check right now for $2 million if you sign off on our tax exemption, right? And depending, again, how much money the company's offering, how long that payment's going to go, what the school board chooses to invest the $2 million in, like that's all very kind of project by project. But there are, I think to your point in that question, there are ways to think about how could you, not force is the wrong word, but how could you get some of this money back into public services that maybe grow the economy more? So I think that's something to think about. Is that legal? Yes, in Ohio, it is actually legal. The school district can accept outside payment. Is it legal to walk in and say, we'll give you this if you vote for it? I think there's probably some quid pro quo, like illegalities, but for all intents and purposes in practice, what we see is that a school board will approve an exemption, and then the company will make a donation to the school district that is sometimes a rather large amount. We have the report just released. You all are the first who have heard about it. The link just went live when we started this webinar. So we haven't gotten any industry or government feedback yet, but we'll see what comes of that. My hope is yes, because I hope somebody reads the report, but you never know. So and then any specific facility by facility analysis. So this is something that we have in the pipeline, thinking about looking at facility by facility. I will say it's very, very hard to look at one factory and say, because a lot of that data is private, right? A company's not going to come out and tell us how many workers work there and what their salaries are. It's personal information. So it's really hard to go to a city like New Orleans or Baton Rouge and pick one factory and say this factory worked or it didn't by itself, because it's part of this ecosystem of factories. You could have a situation where other things in New Orleans have kind of buoyed the economy, right? So maybe the economy, the big picture, it looks flat, it doesn't look like it grew, or it grew a little bit. But it grew a little bit because small businesses spiked this year. And, if you don't look at that, you'll never notice that. But really, the factory that we're talking about did bad, but the economy overall did good. So you start to get this really complicated web when you start looking site by site, which is part of the reason this report took the whole approach of let's look at all the parishes in the state over multiple years and get as much data as we can. Did the state grow or did it not in income and jobs? And the answer is it didn't in either. That doesn't mean that a single parish didn't grow. Some parishes did well, some parishes didn't. But when you take the state as a whole, I think our question we really ask is, okay, if ITEP helps some parishes grow but hurts others, is that a good state economic development policy, right? If you're just kind of shuffling deck chairs around in the state and trying to say, well, now this parish is wealthier compared to this one because of ITEP moved a factory here, and So rearranging deck chairs is usually not a great policy to avoid the iceberg, right? And so you really want to think about, is there a different course we could take altogether instead of just trying to do this? And yeah, I think New Orleans is an anomaly, right? And you see that in any state. We've done a lot of work around a Shell plant in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, that does look at a specific site. But the reason why is because it's in a parish or a county up here that is relatively small. And so you would expect a multi-billion-dollar investment. You would expect to see some sort of spike in data, right? If it had an effect. And so you kind of get these weird cases where you might be able to analyze a specific project, but a lot of times in a big city or a MSA, a statistical area, it's really hard to kind of tease out an individual company's impact, which is why this report kind of makes the case overall. And I think we're also hoping to look in the future at some of the things going on out in the west part of the state, in Cameron Parish, and some of the news around the export terminal, which was a huge ITEP recipient, has received kind of the halt from the president, from President Biden. And so there's a lot of discussion around, what would the economic impact of something like that be in such a rural area? So the links to the formative analysis for the ITEP stuff we can grab, or you can drop in the chat. But yeah, so Giving Away the Farm was kind of the first iteration of this that looked at Together Baton Rouge and Together Louisiana looked at ITEP. And again, I really want to stress, and thanks Dustin for sharing that. I really want to stress, I am like the newcomer. I am just the person who looked at all of the work that has been going on for over a decade, more than that, in the state, and basically said, can we analyze this from a 36,000-foot view and apply some of these more sophisticated models and actually come up with like a data result that I think underscores all of the conclusions that the formative work drew. So hats off and thanks to all of you who have kind of been fighting this fight and doing this research for much longer than I have. It's makes other researchers' jobs easier to come into it and kind of bring a new eye with all the great work you've done. Is it antithetical to Republican small business ideologies to take away power from local government bodies? That kind of strays outside my expertise. I think that's a really political question. I can't speak for the Republican Party's ideology. I will say anecdotally, I hear a lot of rhetoric here in Ohio as well about, big government is bad. Okay, well, a 10-person board that can give away my local tax dollars seems like big government. And I see a lot of rhetoric here, in my state about how small business is good. And well, giving billions of dollars to large corporations who directly then go and are subsidized to compete with small businesses seems antithetical to that. So again, everyone can draw their personal conclusions. I think that some of these programs are probably at odds with being quote unquote anti big government or quote unquote pro small business. I think everybody is pro small business to some degree, right? I'll leave it there. And then any major talking points to use when commenting on potential approvals of ITEP applications. I think really just trying to get the word out, and we'll continue. We post on our site, and Ben, you can send a follow-up email with some links to like Amanda's study to get the word out to folks that this isn't the only option, right? I don't think local folks approve this. Nobody's getting a kickback from the companies to approve this, at the school board level, I don't think, in Louisiana. Like people at the local level are trying to serve their constituents and their communities and do the best they can. And if you're in a hard hit area that has economically struggled, you will take any lifeline that is thrown. And so I think getting the word out that ITEP, the data shows ITEP has not, it's a lot of overpromise and underdeliver consistently year over year in most of the state. And then two, there are pathways out there that you can explore. You don't have to go down any of them, but you can explore better investments with public money than, exempting it for a single large factory. So I think that exploring those options, and again, I hope that just like this report is one in a series with a lot of the work that Together Baton Rouge and Together Louisiana have been doing. I hope to write more and research more into this and find other partners to continue that discussion around what do alternatives look like, right? This report is, ITEP is really bad and hasn't worked very well, and it starts to hint at some of the alternatives, but we really want to get to a point where we can say, here are some possible alternative ways that could be spent that maybe has a better impact in the local community. So I think we're at time perfectly. There are no more open questions, so I think I've done my job. But thank you all for joining. You're always welcome to email me. I think my email's in the report. If not, it's on the Ohio River Valley Institute website. I am completely open to emails. Thanks for adding that in there, Ben. Send me an email. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to keep talking about this. And I also would love to hear, if folks have prior opinions about ITEP or experience with ITEP. It's always great to hear what those experiences are. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I'll just add that again, the report is available for download on our website, ohiorivervalleyinstitute.org. We really appreciate you being here today and for your thoughtful questions. If you have any follow-up questions, please do send us an email. And we hope you have a great afternoon. Take care, everyone.